So now that we've done the part where we talk about how to look at the brain, we're going to actually look at the brain. And people divide the brain up into lots of different pieces. We are going to start at the very beginning with just the three most basic divisions that we can do. This is the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And these divisions aren't specific just to humans. You can look at any species that has a brain, and you can have somebody somewhere will have identified where the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain are. So it's actually a really nice way to orient yourself for different structures when looking across species. So we will start with the forebrain, which is all of this pink stuff at the top. And I always explain to people, so it seems weird for it to be the forebrain if it's the top of our head. But if you think about most species are oriented sort of with the head at the front and then the body behind it and then maybe some legs or something. And in those species, the forebrain is actually this front portion. But if we rotate this so that we have our head and our body and some arms and some legs, our forebrain is now the top part. So it's the same place, it's just that humans are upright, and that's weird for animals. I always take a minute to explain that because sometimes it throws people for a loop that the forebrain, which you think should be at the front, is instead at the top. But our forebrain, this giant pink area that's pretty much the whole top of our head, is a highly developed part of our brain. This is where most of our cortices are. This is a lot of our interconnected pieces of our brain are. And this area has numerous functions. This is part of what makes humans special, is that we have really highly developed forebrains with lots of folds, lots of crevices, which give us lots of surface area for all of these connective functions that we can have. So the fact that we have such a highly developed forebrain is part of why we think people are so smart. Next section is our midbrain, this sort of small green piece right in the middle. And our midbrain is a little bit, try to think of the best way to say this. So we'll take a detour into evolution just because I find it interesting. Primitive, in quotes again, primitive brains, like our most basic biological functions would have been maybe our hindbrain and maybe the midbrain. Some people would say just the hindbrain. Some more distant ancestors, some more primitive ancestors, things that have not gone through as much evolution, would have relied mostly on their hindbrain and midbrain and a very small forebrain. But humans have that very, like we said, highly specialized and more evolved forebrain. And that's part of what makes us distinct from other species. The midbrain would have been very important in a lot of other species if they didn't have the forebrain with all of the extra functions to help out. But our midbrain is going to take care of some of our, again, more basal, more basic functions. So things like reflex actions, so things that are going to happen automatically without us directly responding to them. But it's also going to be responsible for our voluntary movements, so things that we're choosing to do. So that's where a lot of our motor decisions are centered. And then if we go even further back to our hindbrain, those are even more basal or more basic functions. So our vital functions and also coordinating movements. So vital functions being things like breathing and digesting food, coordinating movements being like remaining upright while walking. So we could think of our hindbrain as the most basic of basic biological functions that keep us alive. Our midbrain are going to be somewhat basic, but not as simple. things like reflex actions and voluntary movements. And then our forebrain is going to be more complex functions. And we'll talk about sort of all of the sub pieces of each of these broad categories, sort of one at a time, so that we can see what specific functions fall under each area more broadly. So we'll start actually at the bottom with the hindbrain. And we'll talk about our brainstem, our medulla, pons, and cerebellum. And at this point, I always remind people, when we were talking about graphs, I mentioned that I don't like putting illustrations or pictures in my tests. The same holds true for diagrams of brains. I find it very difficult to consistently show an image that doesn't get weird when you print it or pixelated when you save it online. So I don't need you to memorize where the brainstem is or where the medulla is or any of that. I just need you to know what their function is and that these are part of the hindbrain. So I'm including the images just because I find it helps some people orient themselves within the brain. So here we have our this is at the bottom of our head. This would be the top of our head. This is the front where our eyes are, and this is the back of our skull. And so our spinal cord is coming into the brain here at the bottom. And we can look at sort of the brain stem is where the spinal cord is joining. Our medulla or medulla oblongata attaches to that. The pons is sort of the next chunk up from that. And the cerebellum is actually a little bit of a point of contention. Some people, like our textbook, will group the cerebellum in with the rest of the hindbrain. Other people argue that the cerebellum should be its own separate thing and that it doesn't fall into the hindbrain or the midbrain or the forebrain. So just if you see it placed in a different category, in a different source, that's why. There's a little bit of debate as to where we should put it. But our textbook says it's part of the hindbrain, so part of the hindbrain, we will talk about it. So our brainstem, that point where our brain connects to our spinal cord, that is going to be lots of our very, very basic life support systems. So if you have damage to your brainstem, you're going to have trouble with things like keeping your heart beating, breathing normally, basic life support stuff, all of the things that keep you functioning, maintaining homeostasis so you can stay alive. Our medulla, and I'll swap back. Oh, no, I went the wrong way. Backwards, just for those people who like seeing images, the medulla is the next sort of little nub off to the side of our brainstem. That's going to control, again, some of our basic functions. And this is involved in heart activity, so keeping our heart running, so controlling our heartbeat. Is it too fast or too slow? Is it beating too hard or not hard enough? It's going to control breathing, swallowing, and digestion. So very similar to our brainstem, they both are very critical to us staying alive. And with the medulla, we have all of our sensory and motor nerve tracts are ascending from the spinal cord through the medulla and descend from the brain to the rest of the body through the medulla. It's around this point that we would switch from calling them nerves to tracts, which is probably why they're calling them both. Upwards into the brain is where they're tracts, lower into the body is where they're nerves, and we're kind of hedging our bets here in this gray area. But this is basically where everything that is traveling from our brain to the rest of our body and back again is routed through the medulla. And it seems critically involved in a lot of the things that keep us alive. So damage to either the brainstem or the medulla would be very problematic. Next is this sort of circular-ish piece on top of the brainstem, right above the medulla oblongata, and that is the pons. And this is going to be a relay station. So it does a lot of sending things to the correct part of the brain. So it's going to relay signals between higher levels of the nervous system and the lower levels. So it's going to take information from the rest of our body and decide where in the brain that information should be sent. It's also involved in regulating our sleep and dreaming. And this is going to be involved in controlling the muscles and glands in our face and neck. So earlier when I had talked about the fact that some neurons coming from part of our face don't go through the spinal cord, these neurons would fall into this category of hopping directly towards the pons and skipping the spinal cord entirely. And because of where it's located and what it's connected to, it also seems to have a hand in a lot of our vital functions like respiration. So most of the hindbrain stuff we can point to and say it's involved in life support and keeping us functional. And then next, we're going to talk about our cerebellum. And to give us a visual, I'm actually going to hop ahead because that's easier. And the cerebellum is very easy to find on pretty much every image of the brain because it's this weird sort of striped looking structure at the very back of your skull. So if you reach behind your head, the point where your skull connects to your neck, right above that is where your cerebellum sits. And when we start looking at the functions here, you're going to see why people don't like grouping the cerebellum with the rest of the hindbrain. Because everything else has been core biological functions, keeping you alive. And the cerebellum is responsible for controlling coordination. So keeping your body under control, allowing you to maintain your balance, letting you maintain muscle tone. So if you have to keep muscles tensed to stand upright, your cerebellum is controlling all of those movements. So it's involved in basically all of our movement and balance and muscle coordination stuff. It also seems to be related to procedural memory, which we'll talk about in the chapter on memory, but it seems to very much have a hand in our motor skills. So actions that we can learn to do, which makes sense since it's involved in body coordination and balance and muscle tone. So if we were learning to throw a baseball, our cerebellum would be involved at the learning that motor skill stage, but also at keeping us upright while we learn that task. So the cerebellum is very much the oddball of the hindbrain. And I'm sure you can imagine that there is tons more detail we could talk about for each of these areas, but you will notice I am keeping a very surface level of the detail that we're talking about. For some of these areas, for a lot of these areas, we'll come back to them and talk about them as we get into different parts of behavior, because we'll be talking about the brain parts that are involved in those behaviors. So we'll come back to the cerebellum when we start talking about types of procedural memory in the memory chapter. We'll come back to parts of the hindbrain when we start talking about homeostasis and maintaining balance a little bit later. And so all of these areas, we're just getting familiar with them right now, but we'll add more detail and have a better understanding of all of them as the course goes on, because we're going to just keep building on everything that we're learning. And so with that small PSA out of the way, we can move on to our midbrain. And these are going to be sort of these central structures. And this is a great image because it shows that our midbrain is sort of right in the center. It's in the middle, but it's in the middle whether you're looking at the brain from the top or the bottom or the side or the back or the front. It's this central area that kind of has the rest of the brain wrapped around it. And of all of these, there's a bunch of different pieces here. But you'll notice that there's a little bit of a bracket here where I have decided that these 4 different areas, the gray matter, the red nucleus, the substantia nigra, and ventral region, which are sort of, here's the red nucleus, are, make sure I say them all right, some of the, I had to double check. I actually picked an image that doesn't have all of the rest of these, which is perfect because the point I'm getting at is sort of the red nucleus and the other 3 are kind of located in this area, and they all have a very, very similar function, and we gloss over them because we're never going to talk about them again. So I'd rather you focus on these 3, our reticular formation, our superior and inferior colliculi, which are these 2 little nubs here just above our cerebellum. And these 3 are the ones we're going to care most about for our midbrain. So our reticular formation, it is involved, as far as we know, in regulation of consciousness. So our reticular formation is going to be involved in focusing our awareness, so things that we are conscious and aware of, and also controlling that consciousness and awareness. So if you hear something and you turn your attention to that new sound, your reticular formation was probably active in that process. It's helping you shift your focus, shift your awareness, and control what you are conscious of. And because it's regulating this consciousness, it isn't just things that we're aware of while we're awake. It's also going to be involved in consciousness and unconsciousness of sleeping. So being asleep versus being awake, as well as that attention side of things. And our reticular formation, if we look back here again, so it extends between the 2. So it's kind of bridging that space, which is why we're still seeing it involved in some more basic stuff like sleeping, but getting a little bit more complex as we get into consciousness. And of course, we have a whole chapter on consciousness, so we'll get lots more detail there. For our superior and inferior colliculi, clearly we're keeping it really light here. So our superior colliculi is involved in vision, specifically visual reflexes, and inferior colliculi seems to be involved in hearing. And that's as much detail as we're giving it because these guys won't come up again either. And then for the rest of our midbrain stuff, the 4 that I said you don't really have to know that much about, they're all involved in controlling movement. And if I come back here, they are located right across from our cerebellum, so it kind of makes sense that they're all involved in movement and controlling movement. So we don't spend a ton of time on the midbrain because then we get to jump ahead into our forebrain, which is arguably the cooler part, especially when we're starting to look at behaviors, which is the whole point of this class. So our forebrain will be the most information-dense part of this lecture because this is the part that we're going to keep coming back to as we start learning about all the behaviors that are controlled by this part of the brain. So our forebrain is sometimes called the cerebrum, and it's made up of a bunch of cortexes or cortices. We have our cerebral cortex, which is going to be this outer area sort of at the top, as well as some of these other bits kind of towards the middle, but still not part of the midbrain. So we'll talk about the basal ganglia, our limbic system, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. And for our cerebral cortex, this is going to be the outer layer of the cerebral hemispheres. And so usually in class, I'll put my hands over my head to indicate that the cerebral cortex is the parts that are closest to your hands on the outside of your head. And so it is this outer coating, this outer layer of the upper part of your brain. And for humans, this is going to be one of the largest parts of our brains. And this is what makes us so special in the eyes of a lot of people, because our cerebral cortex is so complicated and serves so many functions. So our cerebral cortex is going to be involved in our thinking and mental processes. And that is a massive part of what we do. So we're making connections between ideas, we're crunching information, we're thinking about things and processing things, and all of that's being done at the level of our cerebral cortex. We also have our basal ganglia, and I'll check back here. So it's sort of this weird curly thing in the middle, that blue coloring, and that's going to be a bunch of neurons that all are involved in motor function. So that's going to help us with our motor actions and sending signals to our motor neurons. We also have the thalamus, which is going to be part of a relay, where it's relaying incoming sensory information through groups of neurons that project to the appropriate region of the cortex. So if I go back again, our thalamus is right at the top. So if we have in behind here, so that's our brain stem, and this little lump would probably be our medulla. And then the pons is in behind the thalamus, and the pons is also part of routing stuff. And the thalamus is going to have all of the signals, so all of our sensory information that's coming in from our sensory receptors. So the things that we have felt, so temperature and tactile sensation, movements and stuff like that, it's going to come in, it's going to come to our thalamus, and the thalamus is going to figure out, okay, is that tactile information? Is it from the hands? If it's from the hands, then we're going to send it to this part of the brain. If it's from the feet, it's going to go to this part of the brain. And we'll look at some of those breakdowns when we get to our motor cortex in just a minute. But the thalamus does all of that routing and sending information onward. And so we'll talk about it when we get into the chapter on sensory information, because routing this information is really important. Our hypothalamus is a little bit of a weird one because it's part of our forebrain, but it's very heavily involved in regulating our basic biological drives. So a lot of our internal processes, our maintaining of homeostasis, is going to be regulated through our hypothalamus. So it's going to keep control of all of those other functions. I just find it interesting that it's doing all of this basic biological drive stuff, but it's in the forebrain instead of the hindbrain. So that's a tricky one that we should keep in mind.